with a lot of people who've worked on Big Ben, because it's important to keep it going. They never got this. This was the first opportunity in the history of the tower where the clock could be fully decommissioned, could be fully stripped
So it
apart.
had never happened before.
No.
Well, welcome back to the Collectability podcast. My name is Tania Edwards, and today we are in London. But before we get started, I just want to thank you for listening, and I have a personal favour to ask. Please push the subscribe button on the bottom right corner of your screen or the platform you are listening to. This will ensure the future of this channel. So if you enjoy Patek Philippe and horological content, push that button now and please comment below when you've watched this video or listened to this podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Now, today, I'm very excited because we have a very special guest, Keith Scobie Youngs, who I personally address as Master.
Thank you.
Because in addition to being one of the world's leading clock experts and restorers, he is the master of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. And the last time, or the first time we met was last year when you were dressed in your finery.
With my gold chain.
Your gold chain, looking
Absolutely.
extremely regal and extremely important as you are. And you very kindly welcomed me as a freeman into the company, which today remains one of the greatest honours I've ever personally received.
I'm pleased you enjoyed it.
I loved it. It was so, so special. So welcome, Master.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't quite know how to reply, but we'll leave it there.
I like being able to say Master. It's not very often that I can say that.
No,
so it's a big deal. It's a big deal. But first of all, a short bio. After studying horology at the School of Jewellery and Silversmithing in Birmingham, England, Keith apprenticed as a clockmaker in London and fell in love with turret clocks and his wife, Lynn.
Best thing that happened to me.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yep.
I love that combination. It's so cool. And it was Lynn, very smart lady, who suggested that they start their own clock restoration company. And in 1990, the Cumbria Clock Company was born. Located in the idyllic countryside of the Lake District in northwest England, behind a medieval castle. Now, not many people can say that, can they?
1260 the car.
1260.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Their large workshop now employs 30 people.
Yep.
The team there and in satellite workshops can undertake the work necessary for the conservation and restoration of church and public clocks. The Cumbria Clock Company looks after over a staggering 1,400 clocks throughout the UK each year, and they work worldwide, having restored clocks as far away as Hong Kong and Fiji. Amazing. As I mentioned, Keith is master of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, but he also holds other important positions, which I'm going to have to carefully read here because there's quite a few. So he is the director of the Antiquarian Horological Society, also known as AHS. He is a director of the British Watch and Clockmakers Guild, the chairman of the AHS Turret Clock Group, and a fellow of the British Horological Institute, who awarded him their silver medal in 2023. Bravo.
I'm very proud.
You should be. He is also an ICON accredited conservator and restorer, as well as an ICON mentor, which is another big deal. I don't think we've ever had anyone so accredited on a podcast before, actually.
I don't know what to say when I hear it read out like that.
I mean, it's amazing what you've done in your career, isn't it?
Well, I've just been involved in clocks, and I think if you hang around long enough, people kind of take you in.
Well, you've mastered a very important niche in the world of horology.
Yeah.
And that is as a restorer of some of the oldest forms of timekeeping.
Yeah.
Turret clocks, or also known as tower clocks, which, as I mentioned, tend to be church or public clocks. But can you explain to our listeners exactly what these type of clocks are and why are they so important in the history of timekeeping?
Well, that's a really good question. Well, a tower clock is really a very large, robust clock.
So for the public to
For
see, big
the
enough
public,
for the public.
big enough to drive a large dial, or more importantly, strong enough to lift a hammer to strike a large bell. Because originally they just struck bell, so they're really heavily constructed clocks, but they also have to keep time. Like any clock, any watch, they have to be able to keep time. So you're combining this huge, some people may say, agricultural side of horology, but you still got to have that precision.
Why do you mean? Why did you say agricultural?
I think because of the size, people compare them to kind of something big machinery, which they are. Some of them are massive, and I think combining that power and the accuracy is something which I really, really like. And when I came to London and started as a turret clock restorer, having that that opportunity to go and see these wonderful machines which sit in fantastic buildings and have been there in some case for centuries, doing the job that they're made to do still. Some of these clocks are 300, 400, 500 years old, even older, and they're still ticking away doing that same job, and you become part of the history of that clock. And I think I just fell in love with that part.
Well, I'm not surprised.
Yes.
I mean, you're a critical part of saving these great clocks. And is it right in saying that some of these very early ones, and we'll talk about really early ones in the UK later on, and you've worked on clocks from 1386, I'm just saying that, 1386. And are they some of the first or the earliest known clocks?
I think there's earlier. On the continent, we know there's earlier clocks. We know there's earlier public clocks. The Salisbury Cathedral clock, which again we'll talk about later, 1386, is the oldest one we've got in this country.
Isn't that amazing?
Which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And that I think that is the kind of wonderful thing, as I've said already, is that just having something working that long. I know it's been altered in the past. Parts have been changed. Of course,
it's had to be restored.
But fundamentally, it's the same thing.
Well, I mean, on a sort of more recent but smaller scale, that's why we at Collectability love vintage Patek Philippe's, because we love watches from the 1800s, the early 1900s, that are still working as well as they were the day they were made.
And there's a story to those watches, like there's a story to my clocks.
Exactly.
Because there's the man who went to, or woman who went to buy that watch in that shop.
Yes.
And then, I mean, you're just passing it along the line, aren't you?
You are. You're moving it on for each generation, and you are protecting our clocks for each generation. So talking about clocks that you have restored, let's just dive straight into probably one of your most challenging restoration projects, and that is the great clock at the Palace of Westminster, which is more usually known as Big Ben.
Absolutely.
But before we say anything about this, let's clarify the name Big Ben, because I think we all know it as Big Ben, but it's not really Big Ben, is it?
No, Big Ben is the bell.
The bell.
Big Ben is the bell.
Big bell.
The big 13.5-ton bell with a crack in it with its unique note is Big Ben. But if I go around telling people I look after or restored the great clock of Westminster, they look at me blankly. If I say I've done Big Ben, everybody knows exactly what we talk about. And Big Ben now has become the name of the whole clock tower.
Of the whole tower.
The whole tower.
And that's what we refer to, everybody refers
everybody,
to it.
When all the tourists come to London, they refer to go and see Big Ben. They're not seeing the bell. They just look at the whole tower. So I refer to it as Big Ben. I refer to it as Ben.
If you do, then
when it hasn't done what I've wanted to do, I refer to it a lot of other things as well. But
I love it. But it also has another name, doesn't it? That it's called the Elizabethan Tower. Is that right?
The Elizabeth Tower.
The Elizabeth Tower after Queen Elizabeth.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
but again, people don't use that, do they? So,
No.
even though we respect that very much.
Absolutely.
Okay, so thank you for clarifying that, because it's been chiming since 1859, so it's quite a long time. And in that 165 years, it's rarely not worked.
Correct.
And even in the Second World War, when part of the Houses of Parliament were destroyed by a bomb, it still chimed, which is pretty extraordinary. And I can remember when I was a youth back in 1976 that the clock stopped working, and that was like the main news, and the whole country was in shock and awe at this.
The heartbeat had stopped.
The heartbeat had stopped. And actually, that's what you refer to Big Ben as, the heartbeat of the nation, which is the most beautiful expression. Can you just tell us what you mean by that?
Well, I've done nothing else but public clocks all my horological life. And that mechanism has a unique tick. You can't help it. It's a unique tick. And so we've got very used to that. And when we were storing it and we had it ticking away in our workshops on the test frame, it did feel like you had transported the heart out of the Tower of Westminster into our workshops at Dacre. And I think that's how you feel about it. That time in 1976 when Big Ben stopped, the chap, John Vernon, who I actually I was sort of an apprentice. He was part of the company I went to work with, or work with that company. He was the man who got it going.
I mean, what a pressure.
And he got it going within a few hours. He got a jack, he jacked up the frame, there was a part of an escapement, an old escapement in the display in the museum below. He went and got that. And I think it was only 6 hours that it was stopped.
But it seemed like an eternity.
It did, but the chimes weren't working. I think it was the Westminster chimes are, such a strong sound to the people of the UK. So I think that's what was missing. But John got that up and running. And so when we were privileged enough to get that job to do the clock, it was wonderful thinking of John, who used to tell me the stories about it, and whose photographs I've looked at repairing the clock, and whose graffiti I found on the clock when I was restoring it, which I thought was very funny.
Now that's very interesting. That's one of the questions I actually wanted to ask you is, did you find any signatures or notes or anything like that?
Lots of people who had worked on it had just described their name. And again, I happen to know the ones from Thwaites and Reed who got the contract in the 70s. I knew several of those. My old governor, Vic Adams, was the first person up in the tower after that breakdown. And Albert Ferry, the clock winder, and John Vernon, they were all very much involved with that project. So, I mean, when I was a young clockmaker at 20 years old, being driven around Parliament Square, these people would tell me stories about Big Ben. And I'd think, I'd never work on that. And then, bang.
Wow.
There you go. I get the job.
That's unbelievable, isn't it? And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but the first time you worked on helping to restore Big Ben was in 2007. Is that correct?
So in 2007, I mean, at the Palace of Westminster, they have a clock team which look after it day to day. They do a great job.
There's 3 people, is that right?
There's 3 people. There's Andrew, Ian, and Hugh, and they do the day-to-day running and maintenance.
So 3 people full time.
They also happen to look after the other 2,000 odd clocks within the palace. It's not just that one. So they have a very busy.
They're very busy
time. We work with them, looking after with the maintenance of the clock. But it's an amazing machine.
Gosh. So let's fast forward then to when you were asked to come and restore, because this is a really big job. So you'd already done some work in 2007, is that right?
That's right. So what I meant to add there was that they were having to do some work to a part of the clock.
A part of the clock.
And so we made a synchronous big electric drive so the dials could show the right time while they're doing
While they're working. Oh, that was clever.
And that's still up there. And we still use that. And so we did that in 2007. It was Ian, Hugh, and a chap called Paul who did a big repair job to the hour strike and some other parts to the going train. But with a lot of people who've worked on Big Ben, because it's important to keep it going, they never got this. This was the first opportunity in the history of the tower where the clock could be fully decommissioned. could be fully stripped
So it
apart.
had never happened before.
No,
In 160 plus
No.
years, it's never
no.
happened.
They'd had maintenances,
Right, of course. Of
but
course.
nothing to this
So
scale.
why did they need to do that?
I think there was an opportunity where they were restoring the whole tower. And if you're going to restore any building, if you're going to decorate your kitchen, Tania, you're not going to take the back off your Patek watch, put it on the kitchen table,
No, I'm not.
and do
Right.
the decorating.
You're so right.
You've got this. Okay, it's a big 5.5 ton mechanism, but it's a precision instrument. So if you're going to do decorating or restoration work in that room, you have to strip it all out.
Wow.
And the whole installation, when you take all the hammers, the weights, the clock mechanism, the dial works, the hands, comes to 15.5 tons of mechanism.
15.5 tons of mechanism you had to take out,
Yes.
including the big bell?
No, we left the bells there.
Okay, so
that would have made it a lot more.
I was going to say, woo, I mean, that would have been really scary.
That would have been scary.
Yes, yes.
But all the hammers which strike the bells, we took all those out. The whole thing, we dropped it down the tower into the courtyard, and then moved it all the way up to our workshop.
And so you moved it. I mean, a lot of people listening to this won't appreciate that you had to take them all the way up to the northwest of England, which is quite a long way.
It is.
And how did you have big trucks?
We
with
moved
extra support to carry that weight.
We moved it in. On wagons and in vans. So there's lots of different transport, but we did it secretly. Nobody knew that clock was in our workshops up in Cumbria.
For how long did nobody know?
2.5 years.
2.5 years. It was a total secret.
It was a total
secret. So everybody who works in your workshop,
they just
sworn
kept
to secrecy. Nobody could talk about what they were working on.
They realised what we had to do, and what was even better was the way the village brought into it.
Oh.
This little village in a valley in the Lake District, they all knew we had it,
right?
And it was almost like, not quite as bad as Dad's Army, where there are people hiding in haystacks to make sure nobody came near the workshops. But it was.
But they were protecting.
They were protecting it, and if we had a car go down the drive to where our workshops are, they would say, Keith, there's a car there. This is its registration number.
Love it.
And it was just brilliant.
Your own security team.
His own security team. It was absolutely fantastic. It was
there
their own little secret.
You've got the best of British there,
Absolutely.
getting together to preserve this icon of clocks in the world. Yeah. I love it. So obviously you had to take it, so we can understand, you had to take it to your workshops because that was the only way you could.
Yeah.
I mean, the most important reason you had to get it out because everything was being restored. There was dust. There was a mess.
And they were completely refurbing all the dials. They were doing all the rooms. They were doing all the electrics, running new cables, new plumbing, everything.
So a huge, unimaginable amount
in a very small footprint.
Right.
I can't remember the sizes of the room, but that's not very big.
And then so the whole tower was gutted, and the brickwork with stonemasons would come in and fix those, the tiles on the
and
roof.
It was wonderful seeing the different crafts come in.
Yes.
And the young people, boys and girls coming in, doing the painting, the gilding, all those wonderful heritage skills that we have to keep. And it was just great seeing those people there.
How fortunate that you have that kind of talent in this country to fix something like that.
We do.
Or to restore something like that. And I understand that the team working on this massive project took a digital record of every brick, every tile, every piece. Did you do a digital record of every piece of the mechanism?
So we did a full set of drawings of the mechanism, and then did renders from those. So we've got a 3D model of the mechanism, which is fantastic.
So
it's very
future people,
yes,
they can now.
Yeah,
you've prepared for the future.
Absolutely,
now. People can repair it,
and people can repair it. People can understand it, and it's just a wonderful way of. I think we all, when we're growing up, seeing those drawings in books of how things work, we've got that now, which is great.
Amazing. I mean, that's priceless information. That's for sure. And actually, you're quoted as referring to this extraordinary mechanism as the Apple Watch of its time. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think what I was trying to say is that when that clock went in there, it was driving the largest dials in the world with a minute hand. It had to keep within a second of the correct time.
So at 1 second.
So it
of
could
the
be a
clock.
second
So
faster or
that
a
is
second slow.
extraordinarily accurate for anything, for a watch.
The timekeeping they're getting out of Big Ben now, the team there with Andrew and Ian and Hugh, we're talking hundredths of a second.
That's extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary.
Absolutely brilliant. So this clock was made 165 years ago. It was groundbreaking in its design, what it was to be able to achieve, striking a bell weighing 13.5 tons. And it all had never been done. And I kind of refer to it as the Apple Watch or the smartphone or whatever we want to say, because that in its own way revolutionized timekeeping and or just people being able to tell the time. And I kind of did it for that reason, saying, look, put this in the right place because it deserves to be.
It deserves to be because, I mean, obviously, what I know of Patek Philippe and therefore wristwatches and pocket watches, to achieve that kind of accuracy in a mechanical object is extraordinary. So in the size of Big Ben with 4 huge clock faces, and all of those are kept as accurate as that is really marvelous.
But you've got to remember we've got a pendulum which is 15.5 feet long, which weighs 650 pounds. So it's a little bit a different escapement to what you have in your Pateks.
So let's talk about that pendulum, because the pendulum is obviously very important in keeping that accuracy, isn't it, to your point? And am I right that actual old-fashioned pennies help regulate this enormously important piece?
Absolutely. And the interesting story about the pennies is that when we took the clock out, we actually found the original regulating weights. So these lovely weights that Dents had manufactured to put onto the regulating shelf.
And what did they look like?
They're just like little discs with a stem on. They're beautiful little things. You can pick them up and put them on. And then they made a second shelf you could fit on that, which was very heavy, so you could make the clock gain a second in 15 minutes. I can't remember precisely what it does. And I looked at those and I fell in love with them. And then we had these piles of pennies there. And I said, wouldn't it be nice to get rid of the pennies and just use these original?
The original weights.
I'd have been hung from Tower Bridge if I'd have tried to have done that, because the pennies are so famous.
They are.
And when we work up in the tower, everybody who comes up in the tower want to see the pennies. So we did a little bit of research into those, or the late Chris Mackay, who was Mr. Big Ben before he sadly passed away a couple of years ago. And it seems like the pennies appeared in about 1932. And because when people were regulating it, they knew they just had to add a little bit of weight to make it gain. And you'd obviously have a penny in your pocket and you'd take it and you'd put it on. And 1 penny makes the difference of 2/5 of a second in 24 hours.
Isn't that amazing?
It is. And it's great the way the team work with the pendulum now, because they predict what it's going to do. They can predict that, almost the weather, that it's going to be a 1 penny week or something.
But so this is very interesting, is the weather. So what other things affect this timekeeping?
I think
other than pigeons.
Yeah, pigeons landing on the hands,
and seagulls, and things like that.
Yeah.
Yes,
I kind of think if we can, I mean, the temperature and barometric pressure make a huge amount of difference.
Right.
I think barometric pressure makes the most.
Well, and then there's a lot of that in this country.
There's a lot of that in this country, and I think the team, especially Andrew, who's a mathematician in a previous life, is loving this whole thing about regulating the clock and understanding what it does. And I think we all feel that the pendulum on a clock like this could end up being a really useful educational tool, not just in horology, but people just understanding vibration. I'd like to think that in the future, the palace will kind of use this somehow in teaching younger people about physics and about whatever.
Yes, because we don't think that the effect of the climate and barometric pressure can have such a big effect on things.
Yeah.
But tell me, there's another thing, isn't there, that the tower is actually tilting a little bit because of various things, including the ground shifting, but making the Jubilee
Line underneath.
Yeah. So things shift. Does that affect the timekeeping
Well, I don't know if
it
it shifted very much. I know, I think that was a concern they had when they did the Jubilee line, but I don't think it has. What it does do, by all accounts, is when the sun comes up and warms the brickwork, it does, this point at the top can transcribe a circle of 7 inches in diameter as it moves in the heat, which I find quite funny.
Wow.
And I think, there's all these different things that the team are picking up from the timekeeping of the clock.
Yes.
So,
as you said, great learning.
Great learning. Yeah.
So
horology can teach people a lot of things.
Well, what was the most challenging part of the restoration of this magnificent?
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, the challenge of anything this size is taking out that was hard work.
I mean, how long did that take to get that out?
It took us, just lowering the parts down the wake shaft took us a week to get all the parts down. I mean, it took about 3 months to dismantle the whole thing and get it down the tower.
Wow. Bit by bit, take it all the way up.
Take it all the way up to Cumbria. Then the restoration process. The Palace Clock team came and joined us up in Cumbria, which was good to work with them. And we just restored all the parts, tested what we could, and then bring it back and putting it back up the tower. Again, is kind of a lift and shift process. But we knew it was capable of keeping good time. The most challenging part of the whole project was the power-assisted winding system underneath the clock, which was made by Dents in 1913. And this machine has been with the clock for over 100 years. It was made by Dents. It winds the original weights, and people had lost all knowledge on how that worked. And so we managed to kind of bring that back into working operation. It's a fantastic machine, very, very clever. And that's been, that was the biggest challenge. And it's something, when I look at it, when we go up there now and we put it on, I love seeing, and it's just this thing which comes to life.
So that's amazing, because you obviously had to, you were doing that anyway, you had to take it apart, but then you had to learn how it worked.
Yes.
From scratch, with nobody telling you how to do it.
Nobody telling us what to do.
Why was that winding system put in, just out of interest?
Well, it's quite an interesting story. After the clock had been in the tower for 50 years, Dents was still looking after it. And they wanted to get the next 20-year service contract. So they went to the Houses of Parliament and they said, if we make you an electrical winding system free of charge, can we have the next 20 years service contract? Which is what they agreed to. The thing is, it took them 4 or 5 years to design and build. And I think then they used it. It was a very clever machine. And it was their IP as such. That is their own intellectual property. It didn't belong to the Houses of Parliament. It was Dents. When Dents lost the contract in the early 70s, they didn't pass the knowledge on how that worked to the next company. And I think and then you had the big breakdown in 76, parts of it were removed. And I just think that's how it got lost. So to be able to put it back together and test it, and when you switch it on for the first time and see it lift 2.5 tons of cast iron 200 feet up in the air, that is a feeling I'll never experience again. It was just fear and joy in equal measures.
Oh my goodness! I can't imagine.
The world's most famous clock, and you're thinking, is this going to work?
Oh my goodness! Well, I mean, I wonder when you walk past the clock, do you feel? I mean, obviously, you feel a deep sense of pride.
Massive, yeah,
massive. But are you also a little bit worried about whether or not it's keeping time? Or
of course, you can't help to,
because you're going to be one of the very few people in the world who actually does worry about that.
You do, and
it is a concern.
And also, you can't take all the glory for doing it. And I'm sure, if it stops, people kind of go, "Well, now what have you done wrong?" Thankfully, touch wood, if there's any about it's since we put it back in, it's been really well behaved. We had primed everybody around the Palace of Westminster that, we've taken this clock out. When Dents installed it in the 1815s, it was plagued with problems. So we're expecting problems. We're expecting it to stop, play up, or whatever. And thankfully, we had a number of issues, but they were so few compared to what I was expecting.
Isn't that amazing? So again, a testament to the quality of the mechanism from
Testament to the quality of the mechanism. And I'd also say testament to the way the project team at the Palace of Westminster allowed us to run the project.
So they
understood.
you?
They listened to what we'd have to do, and I think that was really, really helpful.
That's key.
And that was key to it. So there's a lot of people who understood the importance of this clock. It is, at the end of the day, a clock tower. That's its fundamental job. It is a clock tower. And I think then, that's why, everybody, when we got to the stage of the clock going back in, they understood the importance of making sure that we could be able to do what we wanted to do or needed to do.
Fantastic. Well, you've given tours to a number of luminaries from the horological world, as well as lots of different people. But I'm just wondering if could you share a story or two of someone that we might know, a notable person. For example, I understand you took Roger Smith up there.
Yeah, but I mean,
Roger Smith.
he's been up there. All the kind of famous. There's been a lot of clockmakers who, the chaps from Frodshams, they've been up there because it's another wonderful watchmakers. Nearly everybody who has a passion for horology has gone up there.
I mean, because that's like a dream come true, the Holy Grail, the absolute bucket list of things, I think, for anyone in horology.
Yeah. And it's so impressive when you do get up there.
I bet.
And you kind of look at it and see this machine ticking away. You get a feeling for it. It's fantastic.
So what is? Can you maybe tell us something that people don't know about Big Ben?
Oh, that's a.
I mean, I'm sure there's.
But everything's been very covered, and I've been talking about it a lot. So.
Well, I'm just, for example, I understand that, and I noticed this on your watch, that the panes on the glass that show the numerals and the hands are actually blue. They're not black.
No, so the cast iron skeleton frame was made and painted blue. That was the original colour that Pusian wanted it to be. And I think
so it's always been blue.
It was always blue up until the 1930s when it was painted black, because the pollution obviously had turned them black. The one thing I really liked about the whole project was discovering or rediscovering an engineer, a Victorian engineer called Jabaz James.
And Jabaz,
fantastic. And Jabaz James was an engineer from Lambeth, and he did a huge amount of work there, doing all the locks and hinges and all those type of things. But he also made the dials. So we remember people like Isambard Kingdom Brunel, we remember the Stevensons, we remember Telford. But Jabaz James's work has most likely been seen by more people than the work of the other engineers I've just mentioned. And nobody really knows his name. And there's a plaque up on the bell frame. He made the bell frame that Big Ben is hung in. He helped assemble the clock when it was brought up the tower. And he is that like a little hero within the tower. Nobody knows an unsung hero of that. And I kind of I find it's really nice to find somebody like him. And when you do look him up and you look at the things he achieved, he was held in high regard as an engineer, but his name's not out there.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
And so there must have been. So you've been discovering other secrets, and you mentioned at the beginning that you'd find little notes from clockmakers who'd written little things. Did you put little notes in?
We've put some notes in, yes. So we haven't actually scratched on anything. We found a business card in the end of the minute nuts, which hold which holds the hands on, and we put our business cards back into
did. I love it.
We also
that is great.
Yeah, we also made the time capsule which sits at the top of Big Ben now. there's a time capsule which goes right up in the top. And we made that using some of the wrought-iron sheet taken from part of the not the clock installation, but the tower installation. And we painted half of it black, half of it blue to replicate or show, sorry, not replicate,
yes.
going from the black dials to the blue dials. So that's going to be discovered in 50 years' time when they do the next big restoration. So that's quite
Isn't
special.
that wonderful?
Yeah, I think that's really
that's
nice.
That's really lovely.
Yeah, and finding John Vernon's name scratched on places was really nice for me.
I bet.
Because I remember him, talking about these jobs, and then the next thing, and he never got the recognition in my mind for what he achieved. He never, he was forgotten about. What he did was much harder than what I've done.
Wow.
And he got very little recognition for it, which is a shame.
Well, so what I think is one of the many wonderful things about your job is that you do give recognition to these extraordinary clockmakers from the past, and so let's just move on to a little bit more of some of the other clocks that you and your team take care of, because Big Ben is actually quite young, isn't it?
It is,
compared to
in the
some
grand
of
scheme of things. Yes.
In the grand scheme of things, it's a teenager. I don't know. I'd say it's almost a baby compared to some of the oldest clocks, including the oldest clock, which you mentioned earlier, in the UK, which is Salisbury Cathedral. That was it 1386 that it started telling the time. Yeah. And it still is.
It is. It's down in the cathedral now, and you can just go in and see it. And if any of your listeners are in Salisbury, go and see Salisbury. It's an amazing cathedral to start with. It's got a packed full of history, and in one of the aisles, it's got this wonderful wrought iron clock. And what I love about the Salisbury, Wells and Rye, which are the three ancient clocks of Britain, is when you look at the wrought iron work, it's carpentry and iron.
Amazing. And we don't think of that, do we?
No. And I know in America there's a huge appreciation for wrought iron and blacksmith work. Mm-hmm. That to me it's almost like a flat pack clock. That really, you could take
Those
it all
three
apart.
Are very similar, is that?
Yeah, they're all very similar. And because we were fortunate as a company to work on all three, we managed to take them all apart, and we found that it is highly likely that they're made by the same team.
Wow.
Because there were so many fingerprints, so many little things which you would only do if you were making those little marks.
Wow. So let's get these dates so we understand what you're talking about.
1386.
1386 is Salisbury.
1392
Wells is 1392, and Rye.
That's the one we don't really know, because Rye's ended up it's in St Mary's Church, Rye, which again you can go and see.
Another beautiful place in England to go and see. Yes.
And you can go up the tower and you'll see this clock, and that is dated. I can't remember the precise date, but it's something like 1561.
Wow. Okay.
Right. Still.
So there's quite a difference.
Yeah, but I think the general feeling is that the Rye clock was somewhere else, and it was recycled.
So it's an older clock that was bought to Rye 150 years later and put in that
Absolutely,
place.
Yeah.
So how interesting. So I mean, obviously, carbon dating is a way that you could check.
Very hard in wrought iron, but we're hoping to get there with that.
I hope you do. But it's so extraordinary, isn't it, to think that there was this footprint in wrought iron, that's how much these ironmongers, if that's what you call them, iron workers, had mastered their technique.
They're just wonderful, wonderful things. As I said, you can take them apart and then put them back together. You knock the wedges in, and it goes back perfectly square and incredibly strong. I mean, it is wonderful. And I mean, I'm a big fan of anybody who works in wrought iron. I understand the skills. I'm not talented enough to do that. that's involved in making something like this.
Well,
And to do that in 1386.
is mind blowing, because I think we think it's extraordinary enough to make a mechanism, but we don't think that it has to be within a framework that was made all those hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder, you've looked at extraordinary things that were made literally hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I mean, what has this taught you about that time, about those people?
The one thing which is obvious, as they're as clever as we were.
Without the technology.
Without the technology.
Without a computer, without anything.
Without anything. There's no difference between us and them. They in fact, they most likely had more time to spend on that type of thing. And it's a joy to see and feel that.
Yes.
You know, you just sit there and you just appreciate the intellect and the ability of those men and women who built those machines or worked on those things and looked after them. I mean, I'm one, if there's a clock there which is 1386, I'm a carer now in 2025. How many carers have there been?
Yeah.
I mean, the guy who or woman who made that clock back in 1386, I mean, I wonder if they had any idea of how long that mechanism was going to work for and how long people were going to appreciate it.
They couldn't possibly have known, could
No.
Predicted something as extraordinary as that.
And it just, even if you go along, I think if you can go along to Salisbury Cathedral and see that clock and get that in your mind and just hear it ticking away, it's marvellous.
How
it
wonderful.
Really is
How
marvellous.
wonderful. So special, so special. Now, it actually brings me to this issue, because one of our biggest issues is this, that we struggle with in the world of vintage watches, is the balance between restoration versus preserving originality.
Yes.
And I imagine that for you, there is a very fine balance to ensure functionality. You've got to get things working again. But you need to preserve just what you've been talking about.
Yes.
Which is this extraordinary craftsmanship that arguably does not exist anymore.
No.
So is that something you wrestle with?
It is, and I think this is where anybody who's in conservation and restoration, every job has to be approached unique. It's a unique job. Every job has to be sat down. There's not one technique which suits everything. We are more luckier nowadays that through modern technology, there are more techniques that we can steal from different areas which can be used in conservation, laser welding, all these new areas which we can build up services rather than having to remake.
Right.
Which is really, really good. So if we have worn teeth on a pinion or a wheel, we can rebuild those and not have to necessarily cut a new wheel.
Do the whole wheel, right?
Yeah. So that's one thing. We try to preserve as much of the original finish. Now, when I first started, if a clock came in for restoration, we used to boil it up in caustic soda, get rid of all the original paint, repaint it, polish it, and make it look brand new. Nowadays, we're respecting those original coatings and what they will teach us, and keeping that patina and that age. That's really important in what we do.
That is music to my ears.
Yeah, and because you don't want to lose that. I always talking about watches. Yeah. There's the George Daniels Patek in the Science Museum, with a wristwatch that he put his first coaxial in.
That's right. Yes.
And
yes.
it's the case is absolutely scratched.
Yes.
And marked.
As it should be.
But then you could see in some cases that all being polished out in the past, couldn't you?
Yeah. Well, so for us, we feel very strongly to preserve a watch in its original condition, or how it's aged.
Yes.
Be the dial discoloured or whatever it is, and those scratches show that piece has been worn and loved.
Yes.
And I think that people are beginning to appreciate that a lot more now, rather than wanting something new and shiny looking.
Yes.
And the fact that you're doing that also in the inner movements of clocks, we'll never see. I mean, we won't see what you see. We'll just see the dial and whether or not it's working. That's wonderful.
For an example, this week in the workshops, we're working on a wonderful clock made by Davis of Windsor, very important turret clock maker. And we're working on a clock which dates from 1750.
Mm-hmm.
And it had its original escape wheel.
Wow.
And two of the spokes had cracked on that escape wheel and made the wheel come out of shape, which then meant it wouldn't escape properly. To put that right has taken us, I think, nearly 2 days. It would have been easier to cut a new escape wheel, but we wouldn't do that because there's this wonderful escape wheel which is 275 years old, and so we managed to straighten it, repair the brakes, and put a little ring round it to give it a little bit of extra strength. And that wheel, I'm not going to say we'll do another 275 years work, but it might do another 100 years work.
Amazing.
And then in 100 years' time, the techniques for conservation will be even better.
I love it.
So it's really important that we think about these things before jumping in and say cut a new wheel. I love cutting new escape wheels. I love seeing the chaps in the workshop get a piece of bronze and start machining it all out, and we end up with a lovely escape wheel. But in a way, there's a lot more skill required to conserve something from the past, and it's more satisfying.
You've summed it up, and I hope that everyone listening to this will appreciate that, because it really matters. And if more people would do exactly what you're doing, that would make a big difference.
And it's hard. I can imagine in the world of watches to do that. It's really, really hard.
It is really hard because it's so much easier, as you said, to put a new wheel in rather than repair.
But you've got to get the client to buy into that.
Yes,
haven't you?
I think the hardest thing, to be honest, is the aesthetic, because it's going to be what you see on the outside.
Yes.
People have got to get their heads around that yes. It doesn't look brand new or it doesn't look in pristine condition, and to find something that's 100 or 150 years old in pristine condition is virtually it's not unheard of, but particularly with pocket watches, they do tend to be in good condition, actually, because they were always very well looked after, because they were always a very special thing to have and respected. And that's what's most amazing, because they have these beautiful enamel dials that have lasted all this long, haven't cracked, haven't shattered, because they've been carefully taken care of. But it's wristwatches that have the most wear, obviously, because they're on the wrist and you're moving around
all the time.
Things that we talked about with Big Ben, temperature, climate, all these things affect it. Affect them totally. So I just as a silly little thing, but it's been said that a thimble full of oil was used in an entire year's production of Patek Philippe. So they'd only need a little thimbleful of oil to oil the tiny little movements. Yep. How much oil is needed to lubricate a turret clock? I mean, do you know, just out of interest?
I love that question. I'm sitting here thinking,
Big Ben, do you know, for example?
Well, with Big Ben.
Would it be a bucket?
No, nowhere near that, actually. Nowhere near that. We use a series of different oils on Big Ben, in the same way with a watch you use. So the bearings are bigger. I would say on a service around a clock, around Ben, would most likely perhaps use an egg cup and a half.
An egg cup and a half. Now, there you are. Yeah, you've heard it today, listeners. That is wonderful. Wonderful. Okay, so that's not too much. That's very good. No. Very good. But again, it shows the efficiency of the movements.
Yes, absolutely.
The working way.
And also
24/7, moving.
And lubrication has improved over the years as well. Okay. Which again reduces wear, and also means that the lubricant stays in place better.
Okay, well, there you go. Well, now, you have worked on clocks all over the world.
Yes.
Is there a holy grail clock out there that you would love to restore when it needs to be restored? There's
some wonderful mechanisms out there. I've been really privileged to go with friends to have a look at different clocks around the continent, and the Strasbourg Cathedral clock is just stunning. It's just beautiful. It's so clever and ingenious, and they've got a clever chap looking after that one there. There's the clock in Prague, which is,
Of
again,
course, the astrological clock.
which is just wonderful. And there is, you can sit there and just think about
all these magnificent
clocks.
Yes.
I get a huge amount of satisfaction out of discovering mechanisms in small parish churches which are untouched. One of my favourite of all times is in a small village in Gloucestershire called Buckland, and it was a clock made by Thomas State in 1699, and he made a set of chimes which went with it, which were up in the room above, which played "Oh Dear, What Could the Matter Be?"
Oh, I love it.
It got changed to "We Love This Place, Oh Lord." And it's just like a big hamster wheel with pins, and it's in its own room. And I remember the day I went up there to have a look at this clock in 1996, and it was just a lovely summer's evening. I went up there, saw this almost untouched clock because the clock had been, it's a small village and forgotten about, and then opened the hatch to where this tune playing machine was, and it was just magical. It was made of oak. It looked fantastic. And I think, having a machine which played tunes to a very small village, 400 years ago or 300 years ago is wonderful.
Oh, it's
so
wonderful, yes.
those machines
Yes.
are lovely.
And we
Big Ben's
don't
the holy.
know about those kind of machines,
No.
do we? Unless you live in the village.
Absolutely. Big Ben is, you couldn't ask for a better clock. There's St Paul's Cathedral, there's the Royal Courts of Justice, there's Shelmex, in London, there's all these wonderful clocks.
And then Hampton Court is
Court,
an astrological
which
clock.
is one we look after, and that's brilliant. 1540, the astronomical dial.
1540.
And it's signed on the back, Nicholas Orsam, 1540. And you can look at that dial and you can tell the time of high tide at London Bridge from it.
So that's how Henry VIII knew.
And that's how Henry VIII knew how to get down. When he needed to.
Isn't that amazing?
Absolutely. And the wonderful thing, when you start to understand that dial, if you stand in front of that dial looking at it and then look above at the skies, what you see on that dial is what's in the skies above you.
Incredible.
And that's what they were doing in 1540. Okay, at that time, it was a geocentric dial, so they still believe that the Earth was in the center of the universe. But that was a wonderful thing, and the history of the mechanisms which have been in that tower, I think there's been 7 over time, and it's all these stories that you pick up from being at these places.
Oh, countless. Have you ever thought of writing a book? Do you write them down?
One day, perhaps.
I think you should. You must. You've got so many stories, and you need to share them. Absolutely. So do you? I see you're wearing a watch, which we've talked a little bit about. But so it's magnificent. It is for people who can't see. It is the exact replica of the dial, one of the 4 dials of Big Ben.
Yes. And my friend Simon Mickelmeyer made it for me.
How amazing!
And it's a great one.
Does it keep time?
Yes, it does. Yeah, I'm not saying to 100th of a second. I'll have to have words with him about that. But I think it's it keeps good time, and I just love having it. It's one of those ones which reminds me of the job we did, and it's lovely. It's
very special.
It is.
When did you get that?
Simon gave it to me about a year ago.
How special! Yeah. How special! Well, I wondered if you wear a wristwatch or a pocket watch, because you strike me as somebody who might be a pocket watch.
I do have pocket watches, but I mean, I've got this on this wrist, my iWatch on my
yes.
watch. Coming with a pocket watch would be a little bit over the top, I think. So.
I don't think so, but I love it. I love it. Now, just as we start to wrap up here, one thing that you have said in the past is that the only reason that Big Ben or any turret clock would not work is if somebody could not repair it.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this is pretty critical.
Yes.
So are you seeing more young people coming into horology, being interested? We know there's a big interest in watches because obviously that's an area that has changed a lot. But clocks is a little bit more specific.
Well, I think it's really interesting because I think watches are now driving the way forward for young people to become interested in horology.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the gateway.
That's
watches.
Yes.
And I think seeing people, all these people making watches, and young people getting interested in them, are bringing them into the world of horology. And they might come along thinking, I want to be a watchmaker. And then they start to look around them and think, oh, well, I like clocks in general. And so that's really important. Lynn and myself, when we started the Cumbria Clock Company, we always wanted to employ people. And we have quite a large workforce, as you know.
Yes.
And a majority of those are below the age of 40.
Fantastic.
And they all have a passion for what we do. And that is wonderful. I mean, horology is something which gets under your skin in so many different ways. And it is so rewarding to bring something to life which has been stopped. It's not just that the feeling of yourself when you've got that clock up and running in the workshop. It's also for us when we take it back and put it back into the community. Mm-hmm. And then you start having people telling their stories about that clock.
And what they remembered from their childhood.
What they remember from their childhood, what they remember, we used to meet, I met my husband underneath that clock. There's all those stories.
Lovely stories.
And what we try to do is also bring the clocks back into the community. So if we're working on a church clock in a small village, which is the school, we'll try to get the school to get all the kids to come and sign the back of the dial.
Oh, how special.
So you sign the back of the dial, you put it up there, and they will always know their names on the back of the dial. And in 30, 40 years' time, the dial comes down, they'll remember the name on the back.
And they'll tell their children and their children's children that my name is on the back of that.
Absolutely.
My grandfather, mother.
Absolutely.
Whatever. I love
and
that.
when we did
special.
When we did Manchester Town Hall, which we're still working at the moment, the dials are 16 feet in diameter there.
So big.
Big, but not as big as Big Ben.
Which is what, 22 or 23?
22 and a half feet, isn't it? I think.
Big.
No, 23 and a half feet. The Liver building is the biggest in Liverpool. But what I did is I put them on a stand in the library, and I did a lecture there and said, look, come and take photographs of you and your grandchildren next to these hands. And it became a real popular thing that people were going in there with their grandparents and grandchildren and taking a photograph next to these clock hands. And then that becoming part of the family history.
I love it.
Time, grandparents, grandchildren, Manchester Town Hall, the centre there. Mm-hmm. And I kind of, if your listeners, your readers are get involved with a large public clock restoration, wherever they are in the world, try to do something similar, because that's how I think we stimulate an interest in horology. It's just those little things that you can do.
Well, they become real to people then, don't they?
They do become real to things, yeah.
Because just to show the hands, that little detail that, obviously they're talking about scale, how big they were. But yeah, I love that, yes. And I hope that people do follow your advice, because that makes a difference, doesn't it?
I think so. And I think you touched on something earlier, which is about with the watches. Unfortunately, the owners don't see inside the watch.
Yes.
I think the wonderful thing about turret clocks is they are getting more accessible to people. And so people are coming up, and if you can start to tell the story of that wheel being 275 years old, they really do buy into that story. That's a long time, 275 years.
It's an extraordinarily long time ago.
Absolutely.
And thank goodness that there are people like you and your team that have the ability to restore these things and preserve them. And I read that when you were 14 years old, your father, who was very wise, obviously, said to you, if you have a job using your hands, you have a job for life.
Absolutely.
And he was right.
He was absolutely right. Yeah, I've had a wonderful time. He's still alive. He's 98. He still tells me what to do.
I love it.
And so, he encouraged me onto this route, and I've been very fortunate to make a living out of it. And
Wow. I mean, he must be so proud what he's seen you achieve in your lifetime. And you followed your father's advice. Now, not many people do that.
No.
So he should be particularly
Absolutely,
proud.
yeah, absolutely.
Oh, well, listen, it's been such an absolute pleasure
Thank you.
to speak with you, Keith. And I really thank you because you made a long journey today. You had to come down from your world of paradise into this big smoke city of London.
Yep.
And it means a lot to us at
Been worth every
Collectability.
moment.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to say to our lovely listeners, thank you for joining us today. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes. And don't forget to leave some comments because we'd love to hear what you thought about this very interesting talk today. And so I'm going to conclude and say this is Tania Edwards for Collectability. Thank you.